Well, thank you very much for this invitation to meet with you today. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, and then it went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, as you know, it succeeded in persuading the Supreme Court to abolish legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Supreme Court decision, it gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a new civil rights movement of activists. They engaged in marches, in demonstrations, in civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. Others were severely injured. But by the end of the 1960s, the Brown versus Board of Education inspired movement succeeded in persuading much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to Blacks and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. With that understanding, it succeeded in ending segregation in public accommodations, restaurants, for example, in public transportation, buses, for example. And then in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in ending ongoing future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, if it were enforced. It's not fully enforced, as you and your members know, but if enforced, it would prohibit ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But yet, the civil rights movement then ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all African-American or mostly African-American. How could it be? If we persuaded much of the country that residential segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both Blacks and whites, incompatible with a democratic society, how could we leave untouched the biggest segregation of all? I've lived in many, many metropolitan areas in the course of my long life. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all Black or mostly Black. Well, partly, I think the reason we left this untouched is because undoing residential segregation is a lot harder than undoing the other forms of segregation that we fixed. If we pass an ordinance prohibiting segregation in restaurants, the next day anybody can go to any restaurant. We can pass as many ordinances as we want prohibiting segregation in neighborhoods, and the next thing things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, Blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, Northerners, Southerners, Easterners, Westerners, adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for failing to redress the biggest segregation of all. And that rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges and universities and schools and public accommodations and public transportation, that was all required by government. It's a civil rights violation of the Constitution. If the federal government, for example, was requiring segregation of trains that crossed the Mason-Dixon line, that was a Fifth Amendment violation, something that we as Americans have an obligation to fix. If state and local governments were requiring segregation of public accommodations, that's a 14th Amendment violation, something we also have an obligation to fix. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That's something that wasn't done by government. It was done by private, bigoted homeowners who wouldn't sell or rent to Black families in white neighborhoods. Or maybe private businesses, real estate agencies, banks, developers that discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way, and so we self-segregate. We choose segregated neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just an income difference issue. On average, African Americans have lower incomes, family incomes than whites, not in every case, but on average. And so there are many African Americans who can't afford to move to middle class neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, discriminatory, but not governmental actions is what created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. It's not our obligation to do anything about it because it's not a constitutional violation. Well, let me give you some background on me and what I was doing and how I came to this work. Prior to writing this book, The Color of Law, I was a writer about education policy. I really knew very little about housing. I was an education columnist, I understood in the 1990s and 2000s, the early 2000s, maybe some of you are too young to remember those days, but in the 1990s and 2000s, we had a national education theory that was shared across the spectrum, Democrats and Republicans alike, that the reason that African American children achieve in school at lower levels than white children, we called it an achievement gap. The reason they achieve at lower levels is because teachers of Black children are lazy. They don't try very hard. And if only we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory, but we enacted it into law in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act. The act required that children be tested every year, that the scores be reported by race and income. And the theory of the law was that if you did that and showed teachers that their Black children were achieving at lower levels than white children, they would be so ashamed they would try harder and the achievement gap would disappear. I thought, as I said, this was a silly theory. Of course, there are some lazy teachers. There are some bigoted teachers, but that's not a big cause of the achievement gap. Most teachers are very hardworking and very dedicated. The reason we have an achievement gap is not because of lazy teachers. The reason is that so many children, African American children from lower income neighborhoods, come to school with serious social and economic disadvantages that impede their ability to learn. So I remember writing about one issue in a column I wrote about asthma. As you may know, African American children have asthma at higher rates than middle class children. On average, not every child obviously has asthma, but on average higher rates. And the reason is that more African American children live near polluted industries than white children. More African American children have trucks driving by their homes than white children. More live in dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't, not in every case, but more likely, to be up at night wheezing and then coming to school drowsy the next day. And if a child has asthma and comes to school drowsy, that child is more likely, again, not in every case, but more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma to achieve at a lower level simply because they're drowsier in school. If you have two groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, same health conditions except for asthma, but one group has a higher rate of asthma, that group's going to have lower average achievement. Doesn't make a big difference, a tiny difference, but then you begin to think of all of the other challenges, like asthma, that African American children come to school with. And when you add them all up, you pretty much explained the achievement gap. So whether it's asthma or lead poisoning, African American lead poisoning rates are much higher than white lead poisoning rates, again, because they live in older buildings with lead paint. In many cities in this country, probably not in Oregon, but many cities in this country, water is still delivered disproportionately African American neighborhoods in pipes that contain lead. Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ. No matter how hard a teacher tries, teacher can't raise a child's IQ simply by trying harder. Homelessness, economic insecurity, toxic stress, which has hormonal effects if a child is exposed to neighborhood violence. You begin to add all of these things up, and they pretty much explain the achievement gap, leaving very little explanation for teacher laziness. Well, this is what I was writing about, studying. I wrote a book at the time called Class and Schools, which described all the various challenges that African-American children face and impede their ability to learn. But then I began to realize it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homeless or economic insecurity. What happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges? How can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well-rested, well-nourished from economically secure homes? You can't have that expectation, no matter how many laws you pass requiring it. In fact, the No Child Left Behind Act did not significantly improve the achievement gap. We still got it today, just about as large as it was 20 years ago. The only thing that the No Child Left Behind Act did was it gave schools an incentive to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and spend much of their time drilling children in math and reading and test-taking skills. Well, we call schools, we concentrate children with these disadvantages in single schools. We call them segregated schools. Schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational issue. I still wasn't really thinking about housing. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that involved two school districts, not Portland, but Seattle and Louisville, Kentucky. Both of those districts had a very, very token, trivial school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to intensify segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of a choice of a child a parent who didn't do that. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, and both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, the black parent would be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. Well, the Supreme Court evaluated this program, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Chief Justice explained, he said, it's true, the schools in Seattle and Louisville are segregated. But he said the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And he said the neighborhoods were not segregated by government. They were segregated by private bigotry and discrimination of private businesses and self-choice and economic differences. And he said, if government didn't create the segregation, government is prohibited under the Constitution from trying to fix it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered reading something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two districts involved in the decision some years before. One of the districts that John Roberts said was segregated de facto without government involvement. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. That homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in his all-white suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop that. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home to a black family in a white neighborhood. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the courts, the criminal justice system, this is all agents of government. This is an enormous 14th Amendment violation that's never been remedied in Louisville. And then I began to look into it further. And this is what led to the book I wrote, The Color of Law. I found there were hundreds of cases around the country, not just in border states like Kentucky, but in the East, in the Midwest, in the West, in the mountain states, of police protected, sometimes even police organized and led mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these was a constitutional violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment that the police were involved in enforcing segregation. Every one of them makes it incumbent upon us as Americans to fix it, to remedy the consequences of that violence, of that state-sponsored violence. And it's an obligation that we have never accepted. Well, I began to look into it further, and I found that there were many, many other federal, state, and local policies that were designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area in this country. So let me describe just a couple of them in the brief time we have together today. Perhaps the most powerful one was an action of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the immediate post-World War II period, mostly directed for returning war veterans, but for others as well. It was a program designed to move the entire white working class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. This is how that suburb that I described in Louisville, Kentucky was created as an all-white suburb. It was a deliberate policy of the federal government. At the time, we were an urban country. We weren't a suburban country. There were very few suburbs in the immediate post-World War II period. And if there were suburbs, working and middle-class families weren't living in them. It was for the affluent. We were a manufacturing economy, and the factories needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So if you had a factory district that was employing both Black and white workers, they all had to live in broadly the same neighborhood so they could walk to work. They didn't have cars, maybe take short streetcar rides. So we had broadly integrated neighborhoods in many parts of the country at that time. Not the West Coast, by the way, I'll come to that later, but in many parts of the country. And the federal government embarked on a program designed to move the entire white population out of those areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs to create a white noose around urban areas. It was a racially explicit program. You're familiar with these developments. They are all over the country. Perhaps the most famous one, I write about this in the book, is on the East Coast, Levittown. It was the largest of them. 17,000 homes in one place east of New York City, an enormous project. The builder, Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to build this project on his own. No bank would be crazy enough to lend them money to do it. They thought this was a nonsense idea. Who's going to want to live in these kinds of places? We're not a suburban country. No bank would give him the loans to do this. The only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans, the materials he was going to use, the architectural design, and a federally required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required that he place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. Without that requirement, we would not have the all-white suburbs in this country that we have today. With that commitment, well, let me say, by the way, this was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. This was a written requirement of the federal government. Excuse me. The Federal Underwriting Manual of the Federal Housing Administration was written and distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the application of developers and builders like Levitt to build these suburban communities. The manual said you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who was going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who's going to build an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There is no basis in reality to it whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying that the private bigotry wasn't involved. Of course it was. The real estate industry in particular was determined to discriminate against African Americans. The National Association of Realtors, I think at that time it was called the National Association of Real Estate Boards, had a code of ethics that prohibited the realtors from selling homes in white neighborhoods to black families. So I'm not suggesting that there wasn't private discrimination involved. Of course it was. It was very, very prevalent. But the Constitution doesn't care whether private persons were discriminatory. What the Constitution requires is the federal government not to honor that discriminatory instinct. William Levitt, the example I gave before, he was a bigot. He wouldn't have sold to African Americans if he had the choice. He said he wouldn't. He said he would never sell to an African American if he had the choice, but he didn't have the choice. He had no ability to raise the money to build this on his own. And if the federal government had fulfilled its constitutional responsibilities and said to William Levitt, yeah, we'll guarantee your bank loans, provided you sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis, he would have had to do that or not build the development at all. So his private feelings were irrelevant. And that's why the notion of de facto segregation is nonsense. It's not that there wasn't private discrimination, but it was allowed to flourish and required to flourish by unconstitutional government action. Well, those homes in these suburbs all across the country were inexpensive in the post-World War II period. They cost about, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's about $100,000, maybe a little bit more than that, twice national median income. Any working class family can afford to buy a home if it has a job. In the post-war boom economy, both blacks and whites had jobs, can afford to buy a home for twice national median income. In today's money, as I said, that's probably about $100,000, $120,000. Who can't afford to buy a home like that? Returning war veterans weren't even required to make a down payment, black or white, but blacks weren't permitted to buy at all, down payment or no. Well, those homes, as you know, no longer sell for $100,000. Sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and depending on the part of the country, I'm in Berkeley, California, $1 million or more for these $100,000 homes. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government to buy these homes gained over the next couple of generations equity from the wealth they gained as their homes appreciated. They used that equity, that wealth, to send their children to college. They used it to take care of maybe temporary emergencies, maybe a medical issue, maybe temporary unemployment, short-term unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit racial government policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American family incomes are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's a disparity there. There's a whole different story behind it. Government was involved in that as well. But you would think if there's a 60% income ratio, there'd also be a 60% wealth ratio. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, while African American families have incomes that on average are about 60% of white incomes, African American household wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that every one of us has an obligation to remedy, and it will be costly to remedy, has an obligation to remedy, and it's an obligation that we have never accepted and that we must accept. Okay, let me say a few words before I close about the West Coast. There were very few African Americans on the West Coast prior to World War II. If you know the history of the migration of African Americans out of the slave-holding states into the rest of the country, you'll recognize what I'm talking about. The first great migration brought African Americans from places like Mississippi and South Carolina into Chicago and Detroit, the Rust Belt, and the eastern cities, but very, very few to California or Oregon or Washington. The Great Migration of African Americans to the West Coast took place beginning in World War II, when both African Americans and whites migrated to the West Coast to take jobs in war plants, shipyards, airplane factories in particular, and other war plants. They overwhelmed the communities where these war plants were located. And if the government wanted the ships and the planes and the aircraft carriers and the jeeps and the tanks to be produced, it had to find housing for these workers. And so it did. Everywhere there were war plants, not just on the West Coast, but throughout the country, the federal government built housing for war workers. And everywhere it segregated it, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed on the West Coast because there weren't enough African Americans here to segregate. In California, which I'm more familiar with than Oregon, but I know that the same thing went on in Oregon. In California, the federal government built 5 housing projects for war workers in San Francisco. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans. That one project became the African American neighborhood of San Francisco that hadn't previously existed as a segregated place. Across the bay in so-called liberal Berkeley, just south of the Richmond shipyards, giant Kaiser shipyards that built many of the Liberty ships during World War II. Those shipyards attracted 100,000 migrant workers, black and white. The federal government built housing for those workers in Berkeley and in the neighborhood just north of Berkeley, between there and the Richmond shipyards. For the white workers, it built housing along the residential area, shopping, access to shopping. For the black workers working in the same war plants, it built housing along the railroad tracks and in the industrial area, creating segregation there where it hadn't previously existed. Well, there were many, many other policies that the federal government pursued to create segregation. I'll mention one more, and that was public housing. Not only the housing that was built for war workers, but public housing that we call public housing today. Most of us misunderstand it. We think that public housing is something for poor people. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in the New Deal during the Depression, during the Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. It was for working class families who could afford to pay the full cost of housing and their rent. We had a 25% unemployment rate during the Depression. Unemployed people weren't permitted into public housing. You had to have a good job and a stable income to get into public housing. The reason the public housing was built was both to create jobs for construction workers and to provide housing for people who couldn't find it because there was no construction really being done of private housing in the Depression. Well, everywhere at the Public Housing Works Administration, the first federal agency to ever build public housing for civilians, everywhere it built it, it created segregated projects, separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, creating segregation frequently in those communities I described before, which hadn't previously been segregated. In the great African American novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, I'm sure many of you have heard of him, and I hope many of you have read him. In his autobiography, called The Big C, I'm sorry, no, called, his autobiography was called The Big C. He describes how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. We don't think of downtown Cleveland that way today. He said in high school, his best friend was Polish. Said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school and an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built 2 separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating housing segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and with other projects elsewhere in Cleveland reinforced that pattern. Same thing was true all over the country. This is how segregation in many places was created and reinforced. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. no mystery about them. For example, we need an affirmative action program in housing to remedy the unconstitutional segregation that the federal government imposed. The federal government should be buying up housing, buying up homes in these segregated suburbs that it created and reselling them at deeply discounted prices to African-American working and middle-class families who don't have the down payments to be able to afford housing in those communities because they have no inherited wealth to speak of from their parents and grandparents who got wealth from the appreciation and the value of homes that whites were able to do. At the lower end of the income scale, we have programs that reinforce segregation today that need to be reformed. The biggest program that the federal government has to subsidize housing for lower income families is the low income housing tax credit, a subsidy to developers to build housing for lower income families. That program reinforces segregation because most low income housing tax credit projects are built in low income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing that segregation. They're built there because the land is cheaper. Developers would rather build there because they don't have to hold a dozen community meetings explaining to people why they're bringing Black and brown people into their neighborhoods. And it's easy to rent apartments there because you can put a sign in the window and lower income families will walk by seeing a for rent sign. That should be prohibited. This priority we have for placing house tax credit units in low income segregated neighborhoods. It's not that we shouldn't put some there. Every community should have better housing, but we should place a much higher proportion in higher opportunity communities where families can have access to better jobs and transportation and grocery stores selling fresh food. We don't do that, not because we don't know what to do. We don't do that because there's no civil rights movement today, like the one in the 1960s that's making good trouble, in the words of the late Congressman John Lewis, to ensure that that happens. I'm hopeful that such a civil rights movement can emerge, that can make some progress on this issue. I'm not confident, but I'm hopeful. We had 20 million Americans participate in Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020, unheard of in American history. Most of that 20 million were whites, also unheard of in American history. We have had in recent years white elected Southern politicians running around the South, removing statues that commemorate the defenders of slavery, also unheard of in American history. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than we ever have had before. But unfortunately, that 20 million conducted those Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and then they went home. They put Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns and in their windows, and that was the end of it. What's needed is a new civil rights movement that can galvanize those people who do think they support greater racial equality into a new movement similar to what we had in the 1960s. Of course, the tactics will be different. Of course, the targets will be different to make progress in the redress of segregation. I hope when that happens that some of you will be part of it. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rothstien. Again, like I said, just very illuminating. So one of the things you discuss is, these are federal policies that created this huge wealth gap and income gap that we have today. And you mentioned how this goes back to the New Deal era. So on the face of it, these look absolutely 100% just patently unconstitutional. Were any of these policies tested in the courts?
No, and the reason was that the only civil rights organization that was litigating civil rights issues in the 1930s was the NAACP. It eventually spun off the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That's a litigation organization. It was a nickel and dime organization, had members in Black communities all over the country and whites as well. Actually, it was probably more pennies than nickels and dimes. And it got a grant to challenge school segregation. And it embarked on a 30-year program that ended with the Supreme Court decision, or actually 20-year program, I'm sorry, that ended with the Supreme Court decision of 1954. It had no resources to challenge housing segregation, and housing segregation snuck up on them. Because as I mentioned, these policies all began in the New Deal. School segregation was already in place. It was well known. It was an outrage. It's something they decided to challenge. By the time 1954 came, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund won that Brown versus Board of Education, then they had to turn their attention to massive resistance to that decision to try to get it enforced. By the time the Legal Defense Fund got around to housing, it was too late. The patterns that I described had already been established. There was one case in 1948 rather, in which the Supreme Court prohibited courts from enforcing those racial deed clauses that the Federal Housing Administration required builders to put in deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. It didn't prohibit the clauses. It said you could continue doing that. The real estate industry continued to put them in these deeds, but it said the courts couldn't enforce them anymore. That was the only victory in the housing area that took place. In 1962, President Kennedy issued an executive order prohibiting federal agencies from subsidizing segregation. They complied a little bit, but that didn't stop the real estate industry from continuing to promote segregation. And in fact, the real estate industry became the leading opponent of fair housing laws throughout the country. So the answer is no. Litigation didn't do much to challenge this, and it's too late now for litigation to be the start of it, because there's not enough political support to enact the kinds of policies that are necessary. So that's why my view is, and I'm writing a new book about this and about what a new civil rights movement can do to create the environment where we can enact the kinds of policies that are necessary. But it's my view, you can't start with litigation. You've got to start with a movement that's going to change public opinion and mobilize those 20 million people and the millions more who didn't actually come out and demonstrate, but who supported them.
Okay. Another follow-up question. So what was the federal government's justification for restricting Blacks from being able to obtain, loans? I mean, what was, how did they justify having these particular policies in effect at that time that we're still suffering from today?
Well, the Democratic Party was the party of segregation. It was the party of segregation that from the Civil War on. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Now, in 1932, when Roosevelt was elected, African Americans mostly supported Herbert Hoover, his opponent, because Republicans were more a civil rights party than the Democrats. In 1936, the African American voting population switched and voted overwhelmingly to Roosevelt. Why? They did so, quite understandable, and because the New Deal provided benefits to African Americans that had never been provided before. The Republicans, in theory, were a party of civil rights, but they provided no benefits to anybody. The New Deal provided housing on a segregated basis, but that was better than no housing at all for African Americans who didn't have adequate housing. So, and that, the New Deal provided work programs on segregated work crews. But for people who are unemployed, they would rather have segregated work crews than no jobs at all. So you have to remember that the New Deal has a reputation of being a liberal, progressive era in American history. It was, except for racial segregation. And African Americans had to make a very difficult choice. Should they support a program of segregation if it meant they got some benefits? Or should they not support the segregationist party and get no benefits at all?
Yeah, that's an important point to, to make there as far as that particular quandary that they had to juggle with. So last question for me, and I'm sorry, Alex, I don't mean to dominate this. Part of this is it's very personal for me. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and so I truly witnessed. I saw the long-term effects of redlining and generational wealth building. I could literally see it from where I grew up, right off of Lafayette and Jefferson area by Belle Isle. And then you just go one block over and all of a sudden you're over in Grosse Pointe or Indian Village. And if you look at a map where you can actually see the color coding of this, you see the red blocks where I grew up and you see the blue blocks, and those were the classifications for, for the loans or whatever in those particular areas. So anyway, I just feel very passionate about this. Do you see any new policies or practices or laws that have recently been implemented that are perpetuating inequality or are actually addressing inequality when it comes down to housing?
It's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. The laws that we have today that perpetuate inequality, and there are many of them, are not intentionally discriminatory. But when you have, just think about it, if you have two groups of people who are in different social and economic circumstances, anything you do is going to affect those two groups differently. And more often than not, it affects African Americans worse than whites. So, for example, I'll give you one example. As you may know, we have a property assessment system nationwide. It's a local system in counties, but property assessments are racially discriminatory. African Americans, virtually every community in the country, has been well documented by social scientists and economists. African Americans pay a higher share of their true obligation in property taxes because the assessed values of their homes are closer to their real market values than they are in white neighborhoods. In white neighborhoods, assessed values of homes are much farther below the real market value. So why is that? Is it because assessors go out and try to over-assess African Americans? No, it's because of a variety of factors. One is, for example, as you know, assessors don't go into a home to assess a property. An appraiser does for a bank, but a county assessor doesn't. A county assessor only looks at square footage, number of bedrooms, so forth. So if you have a white home and a black home with the same number of bedrooms, the same number of bathrooms, same square footage in the lot, the assessor is going to tend to assess those at the same value, even though the white home has much better fixtures inside, has done much more remodeling, is a much more higher value home. That means that the white family is paying property taxes at a lower rate relative to the value of their home than the black family does. Well, this is well known. Assessors acknowledge this. They don't know what to do about it. A new civil rights movement needs to cause good trouble to make local governments provide refunds to African American homeowners whose properties have been assessed. There are many, many other examples I can give you of on the face, race-neutral policies that in effect perpetuate segregation. And if we have time, I can talk about more of them, but I'd rather get to Alex's question for now.
No, I mean, Tony proposed great questions, so thank you for sharing both. Oregon, I'll just highlight, Oregon recently just did pass a law banning buyer love letters, which anecdotally we've been shared that has prohibited some potential buyers, from being able to purchase these homes. Are there any other great examples that you've seen that you could share around, other laws that we should, as an organization, as a corporation like Oregon Realtors, what can we do as individuals or corporations do to further, impact that change we want to see?
Sure, I'm glad you brought that up because now we can talk about the real estate industry in particular. The real estate industry, and this is promoted by the National Association of Realtors, has the incorrect view that realtors should be race blind, that they should never mention race, they should never tell people what the racial composition of a neighborhood is, they should pretend not to know. They think that the Fair Housing Act means that you never acknowledge that race exists. That's not what the Fair Housing Act requires. What the Fair Housing Act requires is that we promote non-segregated neighborhoods, diverse neighborhoods. And the real estate industry should be steering families to the extent it can to desegregated neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are diverse, rather than pretending that they don't know anything about what the race of a neighborhood is. So that would be one thing. That would be a big step forward if the real estate agents would start to tell families that, your children are going to be much better off in a diverse school. They're going to be prepared for work in the 21st century economy. They're going to learn to get along with others who aren't exactly like them in their backgrounds. That would be a big step forward. Now, you also know, and I'm sure you know this, that the real estate industry still suffers from an enormous amount of discrimination in the actions of many real estate agents, not all. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the Long Island Newsday expose. I hope all of your members are. And there's no reason to think that Long Island is any different from Oregon in this respect. And so I think, and this is again something that I'm somewhat critical of NAR about, I think that NAR should be financing an independent agency to do the kind of testing that Long Island Newsday did for real estate agents in every community in the country. NAR is presently encouraging real estate boards to do their own testing. I don't think that's credible. I think it needs to be an independent agency, perhaps that has a board of directors that has representatives of the real estate agency on it, as well as fair housing representatives. But we need to wipe out the ongoing steering and discrimination that exists in the real estate industry. And that would be another big step forward. Finally, and this goes along, I guess, with my first comment, we ought to stop misrepresenting the quality of a neighborhood by the test scores of the schools in that neighborhood. I think it's a violation of the Fair Housing Act for real estate agents, for websites of real estate agents to promote test scores of schools. As we know, test scores do not reflect the quality of the school. Test scores, as I indicated at the very beginning of my remarks, test scores reflect the social and economic backgrounds of the parents of the children. And you can have a school that's a much higher quality school that has lower test scores because the children come to school with more challenges than a school that is allegedly high quality because of high test scores. And all it's doing is passing through children who would achieve at high levels anyway. So this nexus between neighborhood quality and school test scores needs to be broken. And the real estate industry needs to do a much better job in breaking that nexus. This is widely known. I'm not telling anything you don't know, but the National Association of Realtors and affiliated groups are not doing enough to do something about what they know.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. I think that was extremely impactful for all of us to hear as realtors in our profession. And, I just can speak to, I know that there's a lot of, anxiety or fear sometimes between members wanting to be bold enough to do some of these actions. And so, last question I'll end this with, and then I want to respect your time, is, we all learn, well, some of us learn best through modeling, and have you observed or any other states or cities specifically with policies that we should model, like, that we could model or look deeper into?
I'm sorry, all of you observed what modeling?
I just, my question was, have you observed any specific cities that
Oh.
have taken a proactive approach to addressing these issues that we could look into modeling?
Yes, yes. There are many small actions are being taken around the country, and some that the real estate industry can actually be directly involved in. There are many, well, maybe not many. There's a handful of communities that have actually created down payment assistance funds that subsidize African Americans to purchase homes that they would not otherwise be able to purchase because they don't have inherited wealth. In most cases, those down payment assistance funds are too token to make a big difference. But the real estate industry, as you know, has a big responsibility in this area. I talk a lot about, and I emphasize the role of government and how we have an unconstitutional system. But the government has imposed these unconstitutional policies at the behest of the real estate industry. We have a revolving door in government. The people at the FHA and the VA who were administering these programs were typically real estate agents who went to work for government. So the real estate industry has a big responsibility here. Clearly, as I said before, I'm not reversing what I said. Government enabled this and promoted it and required it. But it's not as though if it were not for government requirements that the real estate industry would be a non-discriminatory industry. So the real estate industry has a financial responsibility. I wrote an article in the New York Times about a little bit more than a year ago now, in which I described a community in California which had been created in the 1940s as an all-white neighborhood. And the home sold, as I described before, for about $100,000 in today's money. And I identified not only the government, but the bank, the real estate agency, and the developer who had created that as an all-white community. Well, that bank, it was a small local bank, is now part of Wells Fargo. That real estate agency is now part of Coldwell Banker. That developer is still in business creating shopping centers on the West Coast. Those three institutions, Coldwell Banker, Wells Fargo, and that developer, have an obligation to make real contributions to the subsidization of African Americans to move into homes that are otherwise unaffordable to them. So that's a good place to start.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Rothstien. We really appreciate you taking the time to enlighten us about this. I think it's very important, especially, and I highly recommend that our members read your book, because I think understanding how the situation was created, especially considering the government really being behind the creation of a lot of these issues, emphasizes that it's going to take government policies to help get us out of this situation, as well as the efforts of individual members at the community level. But it's always very important to understand the history behind something if you're trying to address it, if you're trying to fix that. And I thank you very much for bringing that to the forefront and enlightening all of us with your research.
Well, thank you. I'm now, as I mentioned to you, I'm now working on a new book about the kinds of answers to the kinds of questions you've been asking about what we can do about it now. And I don't know if you want to assemble a list of your members who want to receive articles like the one I mentioned before that I'm writing out of the work of this book, and a notification of when the book is ready. I don't want to get individual emails from 100 members, but if you would assemble a list of people who want to get that information and send it to me, I'd be glad to have my assistant put it into a
We very much would be
database.
interested in that, and we are going to be providing our members participating in this this webinar with a copy of your book at their request, and starting a book club for them as well. So we're very excited to see the next release and be able to share, bring you back for that. So thank you again.